Welcome to the deep dive. You're looking to cut through the noise, grab those aha moments without, grounding in information, right?
Absolutely. Get straight to the good stuff.
Well, today we're diving headfirst into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. We're going to extract the core ideas, really try to help you laser focus your energy on what truly counts in your life.
And Manson, he certainly offers a unique perspective. He's really known for his direct, sometimes counterintuitive take on self-help.
Yeah, built a huge following through his blog that way.
Definitely.
Exactly. So our goal today is to explore that central theme, intentionally directing your attention and your care towards what genuinely aligns with your deepest values.
And crucially, learning to, well, not sweat the small stuff, or even the big stuff that doesn't actually matter to you.
Right. Now, it's important to understand this isn't about becoming some indifferent blob.
Not at all. It's about being really deliberate. Intentionality, I think, is the key word,
Yeah.
with your sort of limited mental and emotional resources.
Okay, so let's unpack this. And he starts with a really unforgettable example. Charles Bukowski.
Ah, Bukowski. Yeah, a fascinating case study. I mean, by pretty much any conventional measure, he was kind of a mess, right?
Totally. Alcoholic, womanizer, gambler, always broke.
And almost as a footnote, a poet. Not exactly your typical self-help guru figure.
Right, so the initial reaction might be, what on earth can I learn from this guy?
Exactly. I mean, for 3 solid decades, his life was, well, by his own account, just a blur. Booze, drugs, gambling, difficult relationships.
He was kind of the poster child for what many would see as failure, maybe even self-loathing.
Definitely.
Hmm.
Then, almost out of nowhere, when he hit 50, boom, a lifeline appears.
Yeah, this editor at a small independent publishing house.
Took a gamble on him, couldn't offer much money, no guarantee of success. Just this strange belief in his raw voice.
What's fascinating here is Bukowski's response. It tells you a lot.
It really does. He wrote back to the editor basically laying it out. Stick with his dead-end post office job, slowly lose his mind.
Or quit. Try to make it as a writer, knowing he'd probably starve.
And he chose to starve. That's a huge turning point, a kind of radical acceptance of a really difficult, uncertain path.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Even after he achieves some fame, sold tons of books.
His tombstone.
Yeah, his tombstone just reads, "Don't try." It feels like a complete contradiction, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, until you dig a little deeper into what Manson is getting at with this.
Okay, so what's the interpretation?
Well, Manson argues that Bukowski's eventual success wasn't about, desperately trying to become some literary sensation.
Yeah.
It was about fully embracing his flaws, his reality, and just writing honestly about it. Painfully honestly sometimes.
He never tried to be someone he wasn't.
Yes.
No polish.
Exactly. His power, his unique voice came from that unflinching self-honesty, just laying bare his failings, no hesitation, no real self-doubt about showing them.
So the don't try wasn't about giving up?
No, not at all. It was about not trying to be a fake version of yourself, not striving to be something you're fundamentally not.
Okay, so the insight there is that sometimes our greatest strengths come from accepting who we are, flaws and all.
Precisely. Rather than constantly trying to be someone else, someone society tells you should be.
That really sets the stage nicely for his next point, something he calls the feedback loop from hell. This one. This really resonated with me. I bet it will with a lot of listeners too.
Ah, yes, the feedback loop. This is that really sneaky self-sabotaging habit our brains have.
Where you get anxious about being anxious.
Exactly. Or worried about worrying, guilty about feeling guilty, sad about being sad. It's like your mind creates the second layer of negativity.
And it just keeps spiraling downwards.
It really does. Recognizing when you're caught in that meta-negativity is crucial, because it's just a huge drain on your mental energy.
Energy you could be using for things you actually care about.
Precisely.
He gives such relatable examples, things I think many of us, experience, like being anxious about having a difficult conversation, and then immediately getting anxious about the fact that you're anxious.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, I'm being anxious again.
Or worrying if you're making the right choices, and then getting stuck worrying about how much you're worrying.
It's like your brain turns inward and just starts criticizing itself for having normal feelings.
Right. And Manson captures it perfectly with that internal monologue he writes out.
Oh yeah, that was brilliant.
God, I do the feedback loop all the time. I'm such a loser for doing it. I should stop. Oh my God, I feel like such a loser for calling myself a loser.
I should stop calling myself a loser. Fuck, I'm doing it again. See, I'm a loser.
R. It's almost comical, but it's also deeply accurate, isn't it?
Yes.
Captures that self-defeating loop perfectly. Have you ever found yourself in that kind of mental knot?
Oh, absolutely. Arguing with yourself inside your own head.
Mm.
And he points out how this has become almost an epidemic in our modern lives.
Hmm.
What do you think is fueling that?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the constant flood of information, especially exceptional information we get bombarded with.
Internet, social media.
Exactly. It plays a huge role. You see the highlight reels of everyone else's lives, the most extreme successes, the most dramatic failures, constantly.
So it creates this unrealistic benchmark.
Totally. It makes your own, perfectly ordinary life feel somehow inadequate.
Hmm.
And you couple that with this sort of societal pressure to always project happiness, always be positive.
Hmm.
It just creates fertile ground for this negative feedback loop to take root and grow.
To contrast it with his grandpa, right? Like grandpa would just feel bad.
Yeah, feel bad and think, well, that's life, and then, go chop some wood or something.
Right. Move on with his day.
But we tend to overanalyze our feelings and then get anxious about our analysis. It's exhausting.
And this directly ties into the whole idea of the limited number of fix we actually have to give, doesn't it?
Precisely. You only have so much mental and emotional bandwidth.
Right.
If you're constantly caught in these feedback loops, giving a feck about your feelings, you're essentially wasting those precious facts.
You're spending them on things that don't ultimately serve you or your values.
Exactly. And this is where the subtle art really comes into play. It's about consciously, deliberately choosing where you direct your attention, your care, your facts.
Okay. Which brings us to the first subtlety of not giving a fact.
Yeah.
Because it's definitely not about being indifferent to absolutely everything.
Yeah, that's a common misconception. The nuance here is key.
So what is it then?
It's not about becoming apathetic. It's about strategically choosing not to care about adversity, about setbacks, about criticism when it stands in the way of your goals and your core values.
Okay. So you still care about the goal, but not the obstacles.
In a sense, yes. You don't let the obstacles derail you emotionally.
Hmm.
Manson uses that slightly quirky example of himself writing in the third person in the book.
Right.
He just did it because he thought it was the right stylistic choice. He didn't excessively worry about how readers might react to it. He gave a fact about the writing, not the potential criticism of that specific choice.
Got it. Subtlety number 2 then builds directly on this.
Yeah.
You absolutely have to give a fact about something more important.
Yes. This is crucial. To be able to effectively shrug off the small stuff, the inevitable setbacks, the opinions of others.
You need an anchor.
Exactly. You need to be deeply invested in something bigger, something that truly resonates with your values. Otherwise, everything feels like a big deal.
He illustrates this with that really quite poignant example of the elderly lady.
Ah, yeah. The meltdown with the cashier over a 30-cent coupon.
It seems so extreme. Have you ever witnessed a reaction like that, just totally out of proportion?
Oh, sure. And Manson's analysis is insightful.
Why such an extreme reaction over 30 cents?
Well, connecting it to the broader context he paints of her likely life, maybe loneliness, strained family relationships, declining health, a general feeling of insignificance. In that context, meticulously saving 30 cents on a coupon might become one of the few things she feels she has control over. One of the few things left to give a feck about because maybe there's so little else.
So when that tiny bit of control is challenged,
It triggers an outsized emotional response. It's not really about the 30 cents. It highlights how what people choose to care intensely about often reflects deeper unmet needs or a lack of bigger things to care about.
wow. So putting it all together then, what's the overarching point Manson is trying to make with the book?
The core message, I think, is the importance of consciously, clearly thinking about what you choose to find important and unimportant in your life.
It's about intentional choice.
Exactly. And he argues we're facing this kind of psychological trend or epidemic where people no longer accept that sometimes things just suck. Life is hard sometimes.
And that fundamental belief that things shouldn't suck, that can lead to some pretty negative consequences for us.
Precisely. When you believe it's somehow wrong or unacceptable for you to feel bad, what happens? You often start turning that judgment inward.
Blaming yourself, feeling flawed just for having normal human emotions.
Right. And that can then drive you to all sorts of unhealthy coping mechanisms, excessive shopping, substance abuse, even lashing out aggressively, all in this misguided attempt to escape the discomfort of reality.
To really drive home this idea of accepting reality, bumps and all, he introduces this wonderful character, disappointment panda.
Oh, disappointment panda. Yeah, I loved this concept too.
He's great.
This slightly pathetic superhero,
Uh,
right? Less than intimidating eye mask, t-shirt that's seen better days.
But his superpower.
His unique superpower is delivering the harsh, uncomfortable truths that people desperately need to hear but actively try to avoid.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Things like, yeah, making a lot of money might feel good for a bit, but it absolutely won't guarantee your kids will love you. Or, if you find yourself constantly questioning whether you can trust your partner, that's probably a pretty big red flag.
Right. Stop ignoring it.
Or even, what you think of as friendship might really just be your ongoing attempts to impress people.
He's like the ultimate anti-guru,
Yeah,
dispensing these uncomfortable truths with a bluntness that's almost refreshing.
it is. Disappointment Panda reminds us that sometimes the most valuable insights are the ones that sting a little, the ones we don't want to hear.
And this ties directly into the importance he places on acknowledging and actually processing negative emotions, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Manson argues that trying to suppress or deny negative emotions, pretending everything's fine, actually hinders our ability to solve the underlying problems.
They're like feedback signals.
Exactly. Crucial feedback mechanisms signaling that something isn't right. If you constantly ignore the warning light on your car's dashboard, well, you're not fixing the engine, are you?
Good analogy. But he also warns against getting completely swept away by emotions.
Yes, that's the balance. He wisely cautions against letting them dictate all your actions without any logical reasoning. Uses that amusing analogy of like 3-year-olds and dogs.
Right. Who often act purely on immediate emotion and, well, sometimes end up making messes.
Exactly. So emotions are important information, but they shouldn't be the only basis for our decisions.
And pain, both physical and emotional, he says, serves a vital purpose.
It does. Pain signals that something is off, prompting you to take corrective action. Constantly trying to numb that pain or avoid it altogether prevents you from actually addressing the root cause of your difficulties. Pain demands attention.
Okay, now let's shift to a topic that might challenge some long-held beliefs.
Yeah.
The potential problem with having excessively high self-esteem. This really goes against a lot of conventional wisdom.
It really does. Manson traces the rise of the self-esteem movement back to the 1960s. You know, the well-intentioned idea that fostering positive thoughts about oneself would automatically lead to better outcomes.
Better performance, fewer psychological problems.
Right. And this led to various practices, maybe well-meaning but perhaps misguided, like grade inflation, participation awards for everyone.
All built on this seemingly positive mantra that everyone can be exceptional and massively successful.
And he makes a compelling argument that this well-intentioned movement has inadvertently led to some significant negative consequences.
Specifically, the rise of a sense of entitlement in many people.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how this entitlement can become a self-reinforcing cycle, really distorting your perception of reality.
How so?
Well, people operating from strong entitlement tend to interpret every event either as further proof of their inherent greatness.
See, I'm awesome.
Right. Or, if things go wrong, it's an unfair obstacle put there by others.
Right.
Good things happen because of them. Bad things happen because everyone else is jealous or incompetent.
It's a warped perspective.
Totally. And it can lead to significant self-delusion, even manifest as abusive behavior as they desperately try to maintain that inflated self-image against, reality.
He even shares a pretty raw personal anecdote about his own adolescence being, in his words, pretty terrible.
Right, which ironically fueled this period of significant entitlement in his early adulthood.
Yeah.
Especially in relationships.
The cocaine snowman analogy he used for how he chased after women was certainly stark, memorable.
It was a very direct, unflinching illustration of how a deep-seated need for constant external validation, often rooted in past hurts, can unfortunately manifest as entitled and ultimately self-destructive behavior patterns.
And this broader issue of entitlement, he argues, is further amplified by that flood of exceptional information we touched on earlier.
Precisely. The constant exposure through the internet and social media to the absolute extremes, the top 0.001%, the most shocking events.
It subtly conditions us.
Yeah, it conditions us to start believing that this level of exceptionalism is the new normal, which of course it isn't.
And that leads to feelings of inadequacy, insecurity.
Definitely. And then this desperate need to compensate, often through either, self-aggrandizement, trying to appear way better than you are, or sometimes by excessively praising others in a way that kind of indirectly elevates yourself by association.
So if constantly striving for exceptionalism has these downsides, what's the alternative? Manson suggests something that might initially sound a bit negative, accepting mediocrity.
Yeah, that sounds almost defeatist on the surface, doesn't it?
It does.
But Manson's argument is more nuanced. He contends that the deep-seated fear of accepting being average often stems from this flawed belief that a life is only truly worthwhile if it's marked by significant external achievement, widespread recognition.
And that kind of thinking inherently devalues most people's lives.
Exactly. It devalues the vast majority of the human population. True exceptionality, he argues, doesn't come from blindly believing you're already great. That's entitlement.
So where does it come from?
It comes from a genuine obsession with continuous self-improvement, driven by an honest understanding that you are, in fact, probably currently average in many areas and have significant room to grow. It's fundamentally anti-entitlement.
And as part of this acceptance, he emphasizes cultivating a greater appreciation for life's basic, ordinary experiences.
Right. The simple yet profound pleasures, genuine connection with friends, the act of creating something just for the sake of it, helping others in small ways.
Reading a good book, sharing a laugh.
Exactly. These might sound commonplace, almost boring, precisely because they are ordinary, but maybe they're ordinary for a very important reason.
Because they actually matter.
Because they are the fundamental building blocks of a meaningful and fulfilling life in the long run, not the flashy exceptions.
This leads us nicely to another potentially counterintuitive idea, the value of suffering.
Yes, and here he uses that incredible, almost unbelievable story of Lieutenant Hiro Onoda,
The Japanese soldier.
that's the one, deployed to Luban Island in 1944, explicit orders, never surrender.
And he just stayed, fought a one-man war.
Until 1974, decades after World War II had officially ended, lived in the jungle.
It's truly mind-boggling to think about. 30 years. Because of an order that wasn't even relevant anymore.
And his reasoning, when he was finally found, was remarkably simple. I was given an order never to surrender, so he stayed true to that order, that value he held.
Wow. And Manson contrasts this with that other bizarre story, Norio Suzuki.
Yeah, the guy who set out on this quest to find Onoda, a panda bear, and the abominable snowman.
Quite the list.
Right, and he actually found Onoda, but later tragically died in the Himalayas, still searching for the Yeti.
So, both stories, in their own way.
They highlight how humans often dedicate their lives, immense energy and suffering to causes that, in hindsight, can seem either pointless or even self-destructive. It really makes you think about the meaning we create, the values we choose to suffer for.
It really does make you question the narratives we build around our own struggles, doesn't it? Which naturally brings us to the important topic of emotional blind spots in cultivating greater self-awareness.
Indeed. Manson points out that we all have these emotional blind spots. Often they stem from deeply ingrained beliefs, maybe from childhood, about which emotions are acceptable to express and which are not.
So we learn to suppress certain feelings.
Right, and it takes conscious effort to identify these hidden biases and then learn to process and express those previously suppressed emotions in healthy ways. That's the first layer of self-awareness, just knowing what you're feeling.
Okay, what's the second layer?
The second layer involves asking yourself why. Why am I feeling this specific emotion in this situation? This can start to illuminate what you subconsciously consider success or failure in your life. What are your underlying metrics?
And he stresses a third, even deeper level.
Exactly. Understanding your personal values. Why do you personally define something as a success or a failure? What internal metrics are you actually using to judge yourself and the world? What fundamental principles are guiding your choices?
And this is the most crucial level.
He argues it is, because your core values ultimately determine the nature of the problems you experience in life. And the quality of your life is largely determined by the quality of your problems. Choose better values, you get better problems.
And Manson contends that most people aren't actually very good at honestly answering those why questions about their feelings and reactions.
Precisely. It's often easier, or maybe just more automatic, to externalize blame or engage in very superficial self-analysis. I'm angry because that person is a jerk.
Instead of asking, why does this specific behavior trigger such anger in me?
Exactly. And he suggests self-help often falls short here too. It focuses on achieving surface-level goals, more money, better abs, without ever questioning the underlying values driving those desires. Is wealth really your deepest value?
He gives that relatable example of questioning his own annoyance.
Right. At his brother not responding to texts quickly, and eventually tracing it back not just to annoyance, but to his core value of family closeness and his personal metric that frequent communication equals closeness. Understanding the value behind the feeling is key.
And the trick with negative emotions isn't to bottle them up, but to learn to express them healthily in line with your values.
Correct. Feeling angry, for instance, isn't inherently the problem. It's how you choose to express that anger. Does it align with your values? Does punching someone align with your value of respect? Probably not.
And constantly forcing positivity.
It denies the reality of problems, and more importantly, it denies the opportunity to solve them. Manson makes the point that challenges and problems actually add meaning and purpose to our lives. We need something to strive against.
So given all of this, how do we go about cultivating better, more helpful values in our lives? It sounds important, but maybe hard.
It is important and can be hard. Poor values, Manson argues, lead you to give a feck about things that ultimately make your life worse.
Things outside your control, things that don't align with who you want to be.
Exactly, or things that actively detract from your well-being. Better values, on the other hand, direct your precious attention and energy towards things that genuinely matter to you, things that improve your well-being and tend to generate positive ripple effects.
So self-improvement isn't about achieving perfection.
No, not at all. It's about a continuous process of prioritizing better values, which leads to encountering better, more meaningful problems. And ultimately, that leads to a more fulfilling life. Better facts lead to better problems, lead to a better life, essentially.
Okay. And he then sets the stage for exploring 5 specific counterintuitive values later in the book.
Right. Radical responsibility, uncertainty, failure, rejection, and contemplation of mortality.
Let's start with the first one, taking responsibility. This feels foundational.
It absolutely is. Manson makes a really strong assertion here. Personal improvement begins with the fundamental realization that you are responsible for everything in your life.
Everything, even things that happen to you.
Regardless of the external circumstances you face, you always have control over your interpretation of events and your response to them.
Even choosing not to respond is a response.
Exactly. It's still a choice, and therefore you're responsible for that choice and its consequences.
He even puts a bit of a spin on that famous Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, he flips it. He says, with great responsibility comes great power.
That's a profound shift.
It really is. The more you actively choose to accept responsibility for your life, for your reactions, for your choices, the more power you inherently have to shape and change it. Acknowledging responsibility for your problems is the crucial first step towards finding solutions.
He shares that compelling anecdote about the man convinced he was single only because he was too short.
Right. Focusing entirely on an external factor he couldn't control, rather than examining his own values, his own behaviors, his own contributions to his relationship patterns. He wasn't taking responsibility for the things he could control.
And he points out that many people hesitate to fully embrace responsibility because they mistakenly equate it with being solely at fault or to blame.
Exactly. But responsibility, as Manson defines it here, isn't primarily about assigning blame. It's about taking ownership of your reactions, your choices, your path forward.
He shares that personal story about his breakup.
Right. Initially blaming his ex-partner, but eventually realizing his own responsibility not for her actions, but for his own happiness, his own contributions to the dynamic, his own choices leading up to it.
And that shift led to self-improvement, choosing better values focused on self-care.
Yes. And he emphasizes that we often learn far more from our problems and failures if we take responsibility for our part in them than we ever do from our successes.
Even in deeply tragic situations, like the father whose child died.
He certainly didn't choose that devastating loss. He wasn't at fault. But he was ultimately responsible for how he chose to react to that unimaginable pain, how he chose to live his life afterwards.
Pain is inevitable, but we choose its meaning.
That's the core idea. We choose how we frame it, how we respond to it.
The example he used about OCD was particularly insightful, too.
It really was. Good psychiatrists don't tell kids with OCD that their intrusive thoughts or compulsive urges are their fault. They're not.
Right.
But they do empower them by encouraging them to consciously choose values that are more important to them than giving in to their OCD. Values like having a social life, regaining control over their thoughts, being able to leave the house, choosing a different response.
And he also mentions how the internet and social media can sometimes work against this.
Yeah, by sometimes fostering a culture of externalizing blame, pointing fingers, the whole outrage porn thing, it can make it harder for people to look inward and accept their own responsibility.
And he warns that changing your values, taking on this responsibility, It can be hard. It can feel disorienting at first.
Definitely. It can feel like failure initially because you're letting go of old certainties, but it's necessary for growth.
Okay, the next counterintuitive value, uncertainty. This one really pushes against our natural human desire for clarity, for knowing the answers.
It absolutely does. We crave certainty. But Manson argues that instead of constantly chasing some definitive right answer or absolute truth, we should aim for a more realistic, more humble goal
Which
to
is,
be just a little less wrong each day.
I like that, less wrong.
Yeah. He suggests viewing your values as ongoing hypotheses. Your actions are experiments, your emotions and thoughts. That's the data you use to refine your hypotheses.
So it's a continuous process, not a destination.
Exactly. There's no single universally correct dogma or ideology. What feels right for you will be deeply personal, based on your own experiences, and it will likely evolve over time. And that's okay.
So doubt isn't a weakness.
He argues doubt is the very engine of personal growth. It prompts you to question your beliefs, your feelings, your assumptions. Certainty, on the other hand, can be the enemy of growth. It shuts down curiosity.
Nothing is certain until it happens.
Pretty much. Accepting the inherent imperfections and uncertainties of our values and beliefs is necessary if we want to keep growing.
He describes that fascinating experiment, the random points on the screen.
Oh yeah, where people started inventing complex sequences and patterns to explain completely random dots appearing.
It shows how quickly our minds latch onto patterns, how much we want to believe in order even when there isn't any.
It's a powerful, maybe humbling illustration of our innate tendency to construct narratives and then wholeheartedly believe them, even with little objective basis. He also touches on false memory syndrome.
Right, and how unreliable memory can be, like the telephone game.
Exactly. It all serves as a crucial caution against blindly trusting your own internal narrative, just going with your gut without any critical reflection. Our guts can be wrong, our memories can be wrong, our interpretation can be wrong.
The anecdote he shares about his ex, Erin, and her unwavering certainty about their relationship being meant to be.
Yeah, even when faced with some pretty alarming behaviors from his side, apparently. It's a vivid example of how certainty can become completely detached from reality. She believed it so strongly.
And he brings in Roy Baumeister's research on evil.
Which is fascinating. It often stems not from low self-esteem, as you might expect, but from people feeling remarkably good about themselves and their actions, even when those actions are objectively harmful.
Their certainty allows them to justify it.
Exactly. It allows them to rationalize bad behavior. He also explores how we often fiercely protect our self-constructed identities. We avoid actions or information that might contradict our self-beliefs.
Like the party guy example who avoids anything serious.
Right. Or someone who thinks they're a great writer but avoids actually writing much, because failing might shatter that self-image. Or avoiding difficult conversations to maintain the image of being nice.
So letting go of those stories we tell ourselves.
It frees us up. It frees us to actually act, to fail, and therefore to grow. Admitting, maybe I'm not great at relationships right now, or maybe I'm just scared, is actually empowering because it opens the door to change.
The core realization being, if it constantly feels like you versus the world.
It's much more likely that it's actually you versus yourself, your own internal resistance, your own limiting beliefs, fueled by a desire for certainty.
Okay, third counterintuitive value. Failure is the way forward. This brings us back to Bukowski, in a way.
It really does. And Manson shares his own very relatable experience here, graduating college right into the 2008 financial collapse.
Ouch. Bad timing.
Yeah. Losing all his savings, ending up living on a friend's couch, starting adult life as, by most standards, a failure.
But he frames it differently in hindsight.
Surprisingly, yes. He sees it as beneficial because it drastically lowered his fear of future failure. Once you've hit what feels like rock bottom, where else is there to go but up?
Takes the pressure off, maybe.
Right. And he emphasizes that failure itself is relative. It depends entirely on your chosen metric for success.
He mentions growing up with some financial security taught him money wasn't a good metric for him.
Paradoxically, yes. His core values were more aligned with freedom, autonomy, things money couldn't guarantee, and sometimes even hindered.
So he asked himself that crucial question. Decent money and a hated job versus being broke as an entrepreneur.
And maybe more importantly, what's the real loss in trying and failing at a thing you're passionate about? What do you actually lose compared to the slow death of staying in the safe but soul-crushing option?
And he realized even failure brings lessons, growth.
Exactly. And then he makes the critical point. Genuine improvement in anything is built on thousands of tiny failures. The magnitude of your eventual success is often directly proportional to how many times you've been willing to fail, learn, and adapt.
Like a child learning to walk.
Perfect analogy. Falls hundreds of times. Cries maybe, gets frustrated, but never decides, you know what, walking just isn't for me. They just keep trying.
But as adults, we become afraid to fail. We stick to the safe zone.
Unfortunately, yes. We stick to what's comfortable, even if it's unfulfilling. But true success, however you define it, requires a willingness to fail. If you're unwilling to fail, you're fundamentally unwilling to succeed or grow.
And he connects that fear of failure back to having, as he puts it, shitty values.
Right, like if your value is making everyone like me, that's impossible. It's outside your control. So you're setting yourself up for constant failure and fear.
Whereas better values are process-oriented, within your control.
Exactly, like improving my social connections or expressing honesty. You can control the effort you put into the process, regardless of the specific outcome of any one interaction.
He contrasts these with tangible external goals, house, car.
Which often provide only fleeting happiness and can even lead to that classic midlife crisis once they're achieved. Is this all there is?
Because true happiness comes from growth, not just achievement.
That's his argument. It's the process of striving, learning, growing that generates lasting fulfillment. He uses Picasso.
Right, his lifelong prolific creativity.
Stemming from a deep, process-oriented value for artistic expression itself, not just chasing fame or money.
And he acknowledges that big challenges can sometimes overturn everything you believed.
Yeah, and that this upheaval, while painful, can actually be a really positive starting point for genuine growth. Pain is part of the process. Don't just chase highs to cover it up.
He then introduces the do something principle,
Yeah.
a practical tool.
Yes, as a way to combat that paralysis of lacking motivation.
The idea being action first, then inspiration and motivation follow.
Exactly. Don't wait to feel motivated. If you're stuck, just do something. Anything related to your goal, no matter how small. Start the cycle.
He used this himself to build his business.
Yeah, forcing himself to tackle small, manageable tasks, write 200 words, send one email just to overcome the anxiety and build momentum towards the bigger, scarier goals.
So even if those small actions fail, you're still moving forward.
Exactly. When your metric shifts from achieve huge success now to simply do something, even failure pushes you forward because you acted, you engaged, you learned something.
Okay, fourth counterintuitive value, the importance of saying no. This can be surprisingly tough for a lot of people. Feels selfish sometimes.
It can be incredibly difficult. Culturally, many of us are conditioned to be agreeable to avoid conflict.
He shares that personal anecdote about selling everything, traveling.
Right, leaving his apartment in 2009, becoming a digital nomad in Latin America, constant travel, new experiences.
It sounds exciting initially.
It was, he says. But eventually he realized that this constant influx of newness, these superficial highs, weren't bringing him any lasting significance or fulfillment.
Especially compared to friends settling down, committing.
Exactly. He saw them building deeper relationships, committing to careers or places. He recognized this fundamental difference in values. His pursuit of fleeting highs versus their commitment to deeper, maybe harder, but ultimately more meaningful pursuits.
He also mentions encountering more directness in other cultures.
Yeah, like the Russian girl on a coffee date who just flat out told him she wasn't interested.
No beating around the bush.
None. And it highlighted for him the Western tendency towards indirectness, that often excessive fear of causing offense, even when directness would be clearer and maybe kinder in the long run.
And the core point he makes here is crucial. To truly value something, you must be willing to reject what is not that thing.
Precisely. To genuinely value X, you have to be willing to reject non-X. They're two sides of the same coin.
So rejection isn't just negative, it's necessary for definition.
It's necessary for maintaining your values and your identity. If you try to accept and accommodate everything without discernment, you end up with no clear values, no defined identity of your own. You become amorphous.
And that desire to avoid rejection and conflict at all costs.
He argues it's often a subtle form of entitlement, an underlying belief that you should be able to feel great all the time and avoid anything that might trigger negative feelings in you or others.
Which leads to a kind of shallow, valueless life.
Yeah.
Just chasing pleasure.
Focus solely on sustaining superficial highs, yeah. Avoiding the depth that comes with commitment and sometimes necessary rejection.
This leads naturally into the crucial topic of boundaries, especially in relationships.
Yes, and he uses the iconic but ultimately tragic story of Romeo and Juliet.
As an example of unhealthy love.
as a powerful example of extreme, unhealthy romantic love that was completely devoid of healthy boundaries, effective communication, or even a realistic understanding of each other. Pure, destructive obsession.
He even draws that provocative parallel between obsessive love and cocaine.
Yeah, highlighting how both can stimulate similar reward centers in the brain. Intense highs, but ultimately creating significant problems and dependency.
So what defines healthy relationships in contrast?
He argues they're fundamentally based on mutual responsibility and a willingness to both give and receive rejection when necessary, having boundaries.
And poor boundaries in toxic relationships often manifest how?
Usually in one of two ways. Either avoiding taking responsibility for your own problems and blaming your partner.
Or, conversely, taking on excessive responsibility for your partner's problems, trying to fix them.
Exactly. Examples include constantly blaming your partner for your feelings, you made me angry, or feeling obligated to solve all their problems even when they aren't taking responsibility themselves. Codependency, essentially.
So strong, healthy boundaries involved.
A clear understanding of separate responsibilities, a willingness to engage in healthy conflict when needed, not fearing disagreement, not expecting your partner to cater to your every whim or feeling, recognizing you can't control their emotions, only your response, and actively supporting each other's individual growth and autonomy.
He also clarifies unconditional love in this context.
Yeah, suggesting healthy unconditional love means caring deeply about your partner as a person, regardless of what specific things they happen to give a feck about or what specific behaviors they might exhibit at any given moment, within reason, of course. It's not unconditional acceptance of harmful behavior.
So given all this, how do we actually build trust and foster those healthy boundaries?
Well, Manson shares that personal anecdote about his own marriage, the crucial role of honest, direct feedback.
Even when it bruises the ego.
Especially when it bruises the ego sometimes. He emphasizes that constantly prioritizing feeling good, avoiding any discomfort, actually hinders true connection and intimacy in the long run. You need honesty.
And conflict, handled constructively, isn't just inevitable.
He argues it's actually necessary for building deep trust. It shows who will truly be there for you unconditionally even when things get tough. Who sticks around through the hard stuff.
No one trusts a yes man.
Exactly. Paradoxically, navigating painful situations together honestly and respectfully can actually cement trust and foster deeper intimacy than avoiding conflict ever could.
And the willingness to both say no and hear no
Yeah.
is essential.
Absolutely critical for healthy boundaries. Without that mutual respect for individual needs and limits, one person's problems, values, and desires inevitably dominate the relationship. It becomes unbalanced.
Healthy conflict needs open, honest communication.
Otherwise, the relationship is built on manipulation, resentment, misrepresentation, not a solid foundation.
Okay, the final counterintuitive value we'll dig into, freedom through commitment. Seems like a total paradox.
It really does on the surface, doesn't it? More choice usually feels like more freedom.
Right.
But he references the well-documented paradox of choice. Too many options can actually lead to more anxiety, indecision, second-guessing, paralysis by analysis.
And constantly avoiding commitment to keep options open.
Ironically denies you the deeper rewards and fulfillment that often only come through sustained focus and dedication. Depth requires commitment.
He points out some experiences just aren't available without it.
Exactly, like deep, meaningful relationships, achieving mastery in a skill, creating a strong sense of belonging in a place. These require long-term investment. You can't dip in and out and get the same depth.
He shares his personal reflection, committing to writing, one woman, one place.
And finding unexpected and profound rewards in that seemingly limiting commitment, it focused his energy.
So rejecting alternatives can actually be liberating.
That's the paradox. Actively choosing to reject certain paths, saying no to things that don't truly align with your core values or chosen metrics, resisting that constant temptation to pursue breadth without ever going deep. It frees up your energy and attention for what truly matters to you.
Breadth is useful when you're young, maybe exploring.
Yeah, discovering what is worth committing to. But the real richness, the real value, often lies in the depth that only comes from that commitment.
This all builds towards the final and perhaps most profound chapter. And then you die. Pretty sobering title.
It is, and it's anchored by a transformative, tragic moment in his own life.
The death of his friend Josh.
Yeah, his close friend Josh, after a seemingly innocuous event at a party, just jumping off a cliff into a lake, something they'd probably done before.
But this time.
This time, tragically, Josh cramped up, wasn't a strong swimmer, and drowned. Sudden, unexpected, final.
And the impact on Manson wasn't immediate,
No, he describes the realization hitting him later, on his mother's couch. This profound understanding washed over him.
which was.
The fundamental realization that if, in the grand scheme of things, nothing ultimately matters in the permanent sense because death is the inevitable end for all of us.
Then there's no logical reason to be crippled by fear or shame.
Exactly. Constantly trying to avoid discomfort, embarrassment, failure. It's essentially avoiding fully experiencing being alive because life involves all those things. If the end is the same regardless, why let fear dictate the journey?
He connects this to Ernest Becker's idea of immortality projects.
Right. Basically, our deeply held values, the things we dedicate our lives to, these provide us with a sense of lasting meaning and significance, a way to feel like we transcend our own mortality.
And when these values or projects fail,
We experience profound psychological distress. Our sense of meaning collapses. Manson suggests that much of what we give a feck about day to day is actually a form of distraction from this underlying reality of our own impermanence.
so truly not giving a feck in this ultimate sense.
Isn't about nihilism or apathy. It's about embracing the fundamental impermanence of life, accepting it fully.
He then poses what he considers the most important question.
Yeah. What are you ultimately going to do with the one precious, limited life that you have?
And it's a question we often avoid.
Because it's hard, it's scary. It forces us to confront our mortality and make difficult choices about meaning.
But by avoiding it,
We allow trivial, superficial values to hijack our attention and energy. We major in the minor things. Acknowledging the inevitability of death, however, has this clarifying effect.
it makes the superficial look superficial.
And the genuinely important aspects of life shine through with greater clarity. Death, as the only absolute certainty, should ideally serve as a compass, helping us orient all our other values and decisions.
And finding comfort with mortality comes from what?
He argues it comes from connecting with something larger than ourselves, choosing values that extend beyond our own individual needs, desires, and ego.
Values that are simple, immediate, controllable.
Exactly. Values that are tolerant of the inherent chaos and unpredictability of life. This, Manson argues, echoing thinkers from Aristotle to modern psychologists to spiritual traditions, is the true root of lasting happiness and fulfillment.
Looking back at Josh's death,
He realizes it taught him something deeper than just seize the day or chase your dreams. Those were side effects.
the core lesson was
Ultimately, there is nothing to be truly afraid of, ever. Because the worst outcome is inevitable anyway, so why not live fully now?
he suggests actively reminding yourself of mortality.
Yeah, whether through meditation, reading philosophy, contemplating the crazy shit that happens, whatever keeps that awareness central, because we forget easily.
And accepting death makes other things easier.
Ironically, yes. Overcoming addictions, shedding entitlement, taking responsibility, facing fears, accepting failures and rejections. They all become less daunting when viewed against the backdrop of mortality.
The more you peer into the darkness, the brighter life gets.
That's the paradox he leaves us with. Confronting the ultimate limitation actually illuminates the value of the present moment.
Wow. So to bring our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving effect to a close, we've certainly covered a huge amount of thought-provoking ground.
We really have. Key takeaways to maybe hold on to. The critical importance of focusing your limited energy on what truly matters by clearly defining your core values.
Recognizing and breaking free from that self-defeating trap of the feedback loop.
Understanding and embracing negative emotions as valuable feedback, not things to be eliminated.
Taking radical responsibility for every aspect of your life, your interpretations, your responses.
Valuing uncertainty and continuous learning over the illusion of rigid beliefs. Understanding that failure is not just possible, but an essential part of growth.
The power and necessity of saying no and establishing healthy boundaries, especially in relationships.
Finding that deeper sense of freedom that comes through meaningful commitment rather than constantly chasing novelty.
And ultimately, using the awareness of your own mortality as a powerful lens to prioritize what is truly important in your finite time.
It's a lot to digest, but powerful ideas.
Definitely. And here's maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to really chew on. What specific things in your life might you consciously choose to start giving less of a feck about?
What could you let go of?
Yeah, in order to free up your valuable energy and attention for what you genuinely value and want to cultivate more of. What immortality project, in its own unique way, will you choose to dedicate your limited number of fecks to?
Deep questions to end on.
Thanks for diving deep with us.